There's a moment that comes for the avoidant, though it rarely comes when you're still there to witness it. The moment when the defenses that have held them together for so long finally crack open, and through that crack floods the recognition of what they've done. Not just what they did to the relationship, not just what they did to the connection between you, but what they did to you, the specific, irreversible damage they inflicted on another human being who had the misfortune of loving them before they were capable of receiving that love without destroying it. This moment doesn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic revelation. It arrives quietly, often months or even years after you've gone, in the kind of ordinary moment that shouldn't carry weight but somehow does. The avoidant is going about their defended life, maintaining the distance that feels like safety, and then something shifts. A memory surfaces. A parallel situation makes them see their past behavior from a different angle. Someone treats them the way they treated you, and suddenly they understand what that felt like from the receiving end. The recognition arrives, and with it comes something the avoidant has spent their entire life trying to avoid, the full weight of what their patterns have cost another person. When the avoidant realizes they destroyed your heart, it's not an abstract understanding. It's not the intellectual acknowledgement that yes, the relationship ended badly, yes, there was pain involved, yes, they could have handled things better. It's the visceral, embodied recognition that they took someone who loved them openly and honestly, and they systematically dismantled that person's sense of safety, of worth, of being deserving of consistent love. The avoidant sees, perhaps for the first time, that their withdrawal wasn't just distance, their coldness wasn't just self-protection, their pattern of closeness followed by abandonment wasn't just their attachment style playing out in predictable ways. It was cruelty. It was violence done to your emotional world. It was the slow erosion of your trust in love itself, and they were the one wielding the tools of that erosion. This recognition changes something fundamental in the avoidant's internal landscape. The avoidant has lived their entire relational life with a particular narrative that protects them from this kind of reckoning. The narrative says, I need space, and people who love me should understand that. I struggle with intimacy, and that's not my fault. I'm doing my best, and if others can't accept my limitations, that's about their expectations, not about my failure. The narrative positions the avoidant as someone who is managing their own wounds as best they can, and if other people get hurt in the process, well, that's the unfortunate but inevitable consequence of being in relationship with someone who has attachment trauma. But when the avoidant truly sees what they did to you, this narrative collapses. Because the truth that breaks through is more painful than the avoidant has been willing to face. Their behavior wasn't just self-protective, it was destructive. And the destruction wasn't abstract or theoretical, it was specific and personal and inflicted on someone who didn't deserve it. The avoidant begins to see the timeline of your relationship not from their defended perspective, but from yours. They remember the early days when you were open and trusting, when you brought your full self to the connection, when you believed that the intimacy you were experiencing was the foundation of something real and lasting. The avoidant remembers how they met that openness, initially. How they let you in just enough to create a bond. How they were warm and present in ways that made you feel chosen. And then the avoidant sees what happened next. And this is where the real pain of recognition lives. They see how they began to withdraw the moment your attachment deepened. How they became cold precisely when you needed reassurance. How they created distance when you tried to get close. How they punished you for caring by becoming unavailable. The pattern that felt necessary and automatic when the avoidant was living it now looks like systematic cruelty when viewed from your perspective. And the avoidant has to sit with the knowledge that they did this. Not accidentally. Not as a one-time failure, but as a repeated pattern that they enacted over and over, even as they watched it hurt you. The recognition includes remembering specific moments where your pain was visible, and the avoidant chose their defense mechanisms over your need for care. The avoidant remembers the time you cried, and they stayed emotionally distant, protected behind their wall. The time you reached out for connection and they responded with coldness that made you question whether they cared at all. The time you tried to talk about the pattern and they made you feel like you were being too needy, too demanding, too much. The avoidant sees these moments now with different eyes, and what they see is not their own justified need for space, but rather their choice to prioritize their comfort over your pain. They see that you are not asking for too much, you are asking for basic consistency, basic emotional presence, basic care, and they withheld those things not because they couldn't provide them, but because providing them felt threatening to their defended nervous system. The avoidant chose their own sense of safety over your heart, and they did it knowingly, repeatedly, and without sufficient regard for what that choice was doing to you. When the avoidant realizes they destroyed your heart, they also realize that they destroyed your trust in your own perception of reality. This is one of the most painful recognitions because it reveals a particular kind of psychological harm that goes beyond just heartbreak. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant engaged in behaviors that made you doubt your own experience. When you noticed the pattern of withdrawal and brought it up, the avoidant likely minimized it, suggesting you were being oversensitive or reading too much into normal fluctuations in closeness. When you expressed hurt about their coldness, the avoidant likely reframed it as your neediness rather than their unavailability. When you tried to name the pattern, the avoidant likely made you feel like you were creating problems where none existed. The cumulative effect of this was that you began to distrust your own accurate perception of what was happening. You began to wonder if maybe you were too demanding. Maybe you were expecting too much. Maybe the problem was your inability to accept the avoidant as they were, rather than the avoidant's inability to show up consistently. The avoidant now sees that this gaslighting, whether intentional or not, was profoundly damaging. They took someone whose perceptions were accurate and made that person doubt their own reality. They took your legitimate needs and made them seem like character flaws. They took your reasonable expectations for reciprocity and made them seem like unreasonable demands. And in doing so, they didn't just break your heart. They broke your trust in your own ability to know what's real and what's not. The moment the defense cracks. The avoidance defensive structure is designed to prevent exactly this kind of recognition. The defenses exist to keep the avoidant from having to fully feel the impact of their behavior on others, to keep them from having to sit with the shame of hurting people they claim to care about, to keep them from confronting the gap between who they want to be and who they actually are in relationship. But defenses are not impenetrable. They crack under certain conditions, and when they do, what's been kept outside comes flooding in. The crack often comes through a parallel experience. The avoidant finds themselves on the receiving end of behavior that mirrors what they did to you. Someone they're trying to connect with becomes hot and cold in ways that leave the avoidant feeling destabilized. Someone withdraws without explanation, and the avoidant experiences the anxiety of not knowing where they stand. Someone makes them feel like they're too much and not enough at the same time. And in experiencing these things from the position of the person being hurt, the avoidant suddenly understands what they put you through. The parallel experience creates a bridge between the avoidant's defended perspective and your lived reality. Before this, the avoidant understood their behavior from inside their own nervous system's logic. But now, experiencing similar behavior from the other side, the avoidant feels what you felt: the confusion, the self-doubt, the constant scanning for signs of where you stand, the pain of being treated as though you're too much when all you wanted was basic connection. The avoidant experiences these feelings firsthand, and the recognition hits. This is what I did to you. This pain I'm feeling right now, this is what you were feeling then. And you were feeling it because of me. The crack can also come through witnessing someone else go through what you went through. The avoidant sees a friend trapped in a relationship with someone who is hot and cold, and the avoidant sees their friend suffering in ways that look suddenly familiar. The avoidant listens to their friend describe the confusion and pain and hears echoes of things you tried to tell them. The avoidant watches their friend question themselves. try to adjust their behavior to make the other person more comfortable, and the avoidant sees you doing all those same things. And the recognition that breaks through is, you weren't the problem. You were responding to my behavior exactly the way anyone would respond to being treated inconsistently. Sometimes the crack comes through therapy. A therapist helps the avoidant see their relational history from a different perspective, and suddenly the pattern becomes visible not as justified self-protection, but as repetitive harm inflicted on others. The avoidant begins to understand that while their attachment wounds explain their behavior, they don't excuse it. And as this understanding develops, memories of your relationship surface with new clarity. The avoidant remembers specific things they said and did, and sees for the first time how those things must have landed on you. When the defense cracks, what floods in is not just recognition, but profound grief. The avoidant grieves the person they were to you. They grieve the relationship they destroyed through their inability to sustain intimacy. They grieve the version of you that existed before they damaged your capacity to trust. And beneath all of that, they grieve the loss of the narrative that protected them. They can no longer tell themselves that the timing was wrong, that the relationship simply didn't work out. They have to face the truth that they actively destroyed something valuable through their own defended patterns, and that truth carries a weight that the avoidant has never allowed themselves to feel before. The shame flood that follows recognition. Once the avoidant sees what they did to you, shame arrives with crushing intensity. This is not the mild social embarrassment of having made a mistake. This is the deep, existential shame of recognizing that you have fundamentally betrayed your own values, that you have become exactly the kind of person you never wanted to be, that you have inflicted on someone else the very abandonment and pain that your own attachment wounds were designed to protect you from experiencing. The shame is particularly intense because the avoidant self-concept has likely included the belief that they're a good person who doesn't intentionally hurt others. The avoidant may have told themselves that they're just someone who needs space, someone who struggles with intimacy but who tries their best, someone who has limitations but who still cares. The recognition that they destroyed your heart shatters this self-concept. The avoidant is forced to confront that caring, in the absence of actions that demonstrate that care, is meaningless. The avoidant is forced to acknowledge that trying your best, when your best still destroys another person's sense of safety and worth, is not enough. The avoidant sees that their self-concept of being fundamentally good is incompatible with the reality of what they did to you, and this incompatibility creates a shame crisis. The shame includes recognizing the selfishness of their behavior. The avoidant sees now that throughout the relationship, they prioritized their own comfort over your well-being in countless, small and large ways. Every time they withdrew when you needed presence, they were choosing their comfort over your need. Every time they became cold when you tried to create warmth, they were prioritizing their defense mechanism over your experience. Every time they made you feel like you were asking for too much when you were asking for basic reciprocity, they were protecting themselves at your expense. The avoidant recognizes that this was not noble self-care. This was not healthy boundary setting. This was selfishness dressed up in the language of attachment trauma, and the person who paid the price for that selfishness was you. The shame also extends to the avoidant's awareness that they knew, on some level, what they were doing. This is perhaps the most painful aspect of the recognition. The avoidant has to admit that they weren't completely unconscious of your pain. They saw you hurting, they saw you confused, they saw you trying to understand what was happening, and they didn't stop, they didn't change their behavior, they didn't do the work necessary to show up differently. They continued the pattern even while watching it hurt you, because changing would have required them to confront their own wounds and their own limitations, and that felt more threatening than continuing to hurt you. The avoidant sees now that this was a choice, and the weight of having made that choice repeatedly while watching the impact on you creates a shame that feels almost unbearable. The shame manifests physically in ways the avoidant may not have experienced before. The chest tightness, the difficulty breathing, the sensation of wanting to disappear, to not exist, to not have to carry the weight of what they've done. The shame makes the avoidant want to hide, to withdraw even further, to protect themselves from the full force of this recognition. But the withdrawal that usually provides relief doesn't work anymore, because the thing the avoidant is trying to get away from is not external but internal. It's their own actions, their own choices, their own pattern of destroying what they claim to value. There's no distance that can provide escape from that. The grief for what they destroyed. Alongside the shame lies profound grief. The avoidant grieves you, not the abstract idea of you, but the specific person you were at the beginning of the relationship, before their pattern began to dismantle you. The avoidant remembers how open you were, how willing to be vulnerable, how ready to trust that the connection between you is real and would be treated with care. The avoidant remembers the lightness in you, the hope, the belief that you had found someone who would meet you in intimacy. And the avoidant sees what happened to all of that. They see how your openness became guarded, how your vulnerability became self-protection, how your trust became wariness, how your hope became resignation. They see that they did that. They took someone who was capable of beautiful, wholehearted connection and taught that person to protect themselves, to expect disappointment, to doubt whether they're worthy of consistent love. This grief is specifically about the loss of your innocence in relationship. The avoidant understands now that you came to them with a certain faith in love, a certain willingness to believe that if you showed up authentically and loved generously, you would be met with reciprocal care. And the avoidant betrayed that faith, not with one dramatic act, but through 1,000 small withdrawals, 1,000 moments of coldness, 1,000 times choosing their defense over your heart. The avoidant sees that you left the relationship with less faith than you came in with, that your capacity to trust has been damaged, that your willingness to be vulnerable has been compromised by what you experienced with them. And knowing that they are the cause of that damage creates a grief that sits heavy in the avoidant's chest. The avoidant also grieves the relationship itself, but not in the way they might have grieved it before this recognition. Before, if the avoidant grieved the relationship at all, it was likely a surface grief about loss of companionship or about the relationship not working out. But now the grief is about something deeper. The avoidant grieves what the relationship could have been if they had been capable of showing up differently. They grieve the love you were offering that they couldn't receive without destroying it. They grieve the moments of real intimacy that existed briefly before their patterns kicked in and dismantled what was being built. They grieve the version of the relationship where they could have been brave enough to stay present through their discomfort, vulnerable enough to let you matter to them, consistent enough to create the safety that intimacy requires. They grieve the life that could have been built on the foundation of your willingness to love them, if only they had been capable of not destroying that foundation. Part of this grief is about timing and capacity. The avoidant recognizes that you offered them something precious at a time when they were incapable of receiving it without causing harm. The avoidant sees that you were ready for genuine partnership, for sustained intimacy, for building something real, and they were not. But they didn't have the self-awareness or the courage to acknowledge their lack of capacity and step away before causing damage. Instead, they stayed and allowed you to keep investing in something they couldn't sustain, and the inevitable collapse of that investment is something the avoidant now grieves. They grieve the unfairness of it, that you met the wrong version of them, the defended version that could only hurt you, when maybe somewhere in the future, a more healed version of them might have been capable of meeting your love without destroying it. The grief also extends to grieving the person they could have been to you if they had done their work sooner. The avoidant imagines painfully what it would have looked like to show up for you with presence instead of distance, with warmth instead of coldness, with consistency instead of the maddening hot and cold pattern. They imagine what it would have felt like to be the kind of partner who created safety rather than anxiety, who made you feel more secure in yourself rather than less, and the gap between who they actually were and who they could have been creates a grief that is mixed with regret and self-recrimination. The obsessive replaying of what they did. When the avoidant realizes they destroyed your heart, one of the ways this recognition manifests is through obsessive mental replaying of the relationship. The avoidant's mind becomes stuck in a loop, returning again and again to specific moments, specific interactions, specific things they said and did. But unlike the selective memory that characterized their earlier thinking about the relationship, this replaying includes full recognition of the harm. The avoidant replays the moment you tried to have a vulnerable conversation about feeling disconnected, and instead of meeting you with presence and care, they became defensive or withdrawn. The avoidant sees now what that moment must have felt like for you, the courage it took to bring up something difficult, the hope that maybe this time they would hear you, and then the crushing disappointment when they responded by making you feel like you were the problem. The avoidant replays their exact words, their tone, their body language, and sees all the ways they communicated rejection when you were asking for connection. The avoidant replays the times they disappeared without explanation, the days or weeks when they simply went silent, stopped responding, became unavailable. At the time, this felt necessary to the avoidant. But now, replaying these moments from your perspective, the avoidant sees the anxiety this must have created, the confusion, the self-blame, the wondering if you had done something wrong. The avoidant sees that their silence, which felt like self-care to them, was experienced as abandonment by you. The avoidant replays the pattern as a whole, the cycle of drawing you in and pushing you away, the cycle that created such profound instability. The avoidant sees the cycle now not as an inevitable manifestation of their attachment style, but as something they enacted on you. The avoidant understands that you were trying to build something stable on an inherently unstable foundation. They see that you kept trying to make sense of when they would be warm and when they would be cold, kept trying to figure out what you could do to make them stay present, kept adjusting your behavior trying to find the magic formula. And the avoidant sees that there was no magic formula because the problem was never your behavior. This obsessive replaying serves a function. It's the avoidant's psyche trying to integrate what they've done, trying to process the full weight of the harm they caused. But it's also torturous. The avoidant cannot go back and change any of these moments. They cannot undo the damage. The moments replay with perfect clarity, and with each replay comes the full weight of recognition. I did this. I chose this. I hurt someone who loved me. The urge to apologize and make amends. When the avoidant fully recognizes what they did to you, a powerful urge often emerges to reach out, to apologize, to try to make amends. The avoidant wants you to know that they see it now. They understand what they put you through. They recognize the harm they caused. They're sorry in a way they couldn't be before, because before they didn't fully see what they were apologizing for. The urge to reach out feels urgent and necessary. How can they live with this recognition without at least trying to acknowledge it to you, without at least attempting to offer you the validation that yes, what you experienced was real, yes, it was harmful, yes, it was their fault. But this urge is complicated by multiple factors. First, the avoidant has to reckon with the fact that any apology at this point is primarily for their own benefit, not yours. You've likely moved on, done your own healing work, built a life that doesn't include them. An apology from the avoidant now would disrupt that healing, would pull you back into emotional territory you've worked hard to move past. The avoidant recognizing this creates a painful bind. They desperately want to make amends, but making amends would itself be another act of prioritizing their own needs, their need to be forgiven, their need to be seen as someone who has grown, over your well-being, your need to be free of them and their patterns. Second, the avoidant has to confront that an apology, no matter how genuine, cannot undo the damage. They cannot give you back the months or years you spent confused and hurting. They cannot restore the trust they broke. they cannot repair the harm done to your capacity to be vulnerable in future relationships. The recognition that some harm is irreversible is devastating for the avoidant to sit with, because it means there is no action they can take that will make this right. They have to live with what they've done, and the person they did it to has to live with the impact, and no apology changes either of those realities. Third, the avoidant must recognize that you may not want their apology. You may have already processed what happened, arrived at your own understanding, and moved forward without needing or wanting the avoidant's belated recognition. You may have built a narrative about the relationship that gives you peace, and the avoidant's reappearance with their new understanding might threaten that peace rather than adding to it. The avoidant has to sit with the possibility that the most respectful thing they can do is leave you alone, let you continue your healing without their interference, honor your journey by staying out of it. If the avoidant does reach out, and if you choose to receive that communication, the apology that emerges is different from earlier apologies the avoidant might have offered. Earlier apologies, if they happened at all, were likely surface level. Sorry the relationship didn't work out, sorry things got hard, sorry for any pain caused. But this apology, born from genuine recognition, is specific and accountable. The avoidant names exactly what they did. They acknowledge the pattern. They take responsibility without excuse or justification. They validate your experience without making it about their growth or their realization. They don't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. They simply offer the truth. I see what I did. It was wrong. You didn't deserve it. I'm sorry. But even this kind of apology comes with complexity, because alongside the genuine remorse lives the avoidant's hope that maybe you'll see them differently now, that maybe the fact that they've gained this recognition means they're capable of more, that maybe there's a possibility of reconnection now that they understand what they couldn't understand before. And this hope, however natural, threatens to contaminate the apology, to make it once again about what the avoidant wants, rather than about honoring your experience and your healing. The idealization of the lost connection. Part of what happens when the avoidant realizes they destroyed your heart is that the relationship and the connection you offered become idealized in the avoidant's memory. This idealization is different from the selective positive memory that sometimes follows breakups. This is specific idealization that comes from finally seeing the value of what was offered at the time it was being offered, after it's too late to receive it. The avoidant sees now how rare it is to be loved the way you loved them, the patience you showed with their patterns, the willingness to keep trying even as they kept pushing you away, the generosity with which you interpreted their coldness as struggle rather than as rejection, the hope you maintained that they would eventually be able to meet you. The avoidant recognizes that this kind of love, this kind of persistent willingness to see the best in someone while that someone is showing you their worst, is not something that can be easily found. Most people, the avoidant realizes, would have left much sooner. Most people would have protected themselves better. Most people would not have given as many chances as you gave. The avoidant also idealizes the intimacy that existed during the good moments. They remember the times when they let their guard down, when they allowed real connection, when they experienced what it felt like to be truly seen and still accepted. The avoidant remembers the safety you created, the way you held space for their struggle without judgment, the way you loved them even when they couldn't love you back in the way you deserved. And they recognize that those moments of genuine intimacy were precious and rare, and that they destroyed the foundation that made those moments possible. This idealization serves several functions. It allows the avoidant to finally feel the full weight of what they lost, which is part of their grief process. It motivates them to do the work necessary to not repeat this pattern with others. But it also creates a particular kind of torment, because the avoidant idealizes the connection. At the same time, they recognize they can never have it back. You've moved on, the door is closed. The version of you that loved them that way no longer exists. That person was transformed by what the avoidant did to them. The avoidant is left longing for something they destroyed, unable to have it, unable to recreate it, unable to find its equal elsewhere. The idealization also includes seeing you more clearly than they did when you were together. The avoidant sees your strengths, your capacity for love, your emotional intelligence, your resilience. They see qualities in you they took for granted or didn't fully appreciate. They see that you were not too needy or too demanding. You were someone with healthy needs asking for reasonable things. They see that you were not the problem in the relationship. You were someone trying to love a person who was too defended to be loved. And seeing you clearly now, after it's too late, is another source of grief and regret. The contrast with their current relationships. If the avoidant has moved into new relationships since you, the recognition of what they did to you often brings a painful contrast between what they had with you and what they have now. The avoidant may have sought out relationships that felt safer, that demanded less vulnerability, that allowed them to maintain more distance. And in the safety of these more superficial connections, the avoidant may have achieved the comfort they were seeking. But they also experience the hollowness of connection without depth, of relationship without real intimacy, of being with someone without being truly known. The contrast makes the avoidant realize that what they were running from with you, the intensity, the demand for presence, the requirement of vulnerability, was actually what made the connection meaningful. The avoidant sees that the very things that triggered their defenses were the things that created the possibility of genuine partnership. And in avoiding those things by choosing safer connections, the avoidant has achieved safety but lost the chance at something real. The avoidant may also notice that they're repeating the same patterns in new relationships, or they may notice that they've overcorrected. If they're repeating the patterns, they watch themselves become hot and cold with someone new, and they see the confusion and pain they're creating, and they think of you. They think of how this is what you experienced. They think of how they're doing it again to someone else. And the recognition that they haven't actually changed, that they're still capable of and actively inflicting this same harm, brings fresh shame and desperation to do the work necessary to break the pattern. If the avoidant has overcorrected by choosing someone who doesn't trigger their intimacy fears, they may notice that they feel empty in the relationship. They're not anxious, but they're also not engaged. They're comfortable, but they're not alive. And they realize that you brought something out in them, a capacity for depth, a willingness to try, a glimpse of who they could be if they were braver, that no one else has accessed. And missing that, while knowing they destroyed it with their own patterns, creates a particular kind of loneliness. The fear of repeating the pattern. When the avoidant recognizes what they did to you, one of the most frightening realizations is that recognition alone doesn't guarantee change. The avoidant sees their pattern clearly now. They understand the harm it causes. They know they never want to hurt someone this way again. But they also know that their defensive patterns are deeply ingrained, rooted in early attachment wounds, activated by nervous system responses that happen faster than conscious thought. The avoidant fears that despite this recognition, despite this remorse, despite this commitment to do better, they might do exactly the same thing to the next person who tries to love them. This fear creates urgency around doing the actual work of healing. The avoidant recognizes that insight is not enough. Understanding their pattern is not the same as changing their pattern. Being sorry about past harm doesn't prevent future harm. The avoidant sees that they need therapy. They need to process their early attachment trauma. They need to develop new nervous system responses to intimacy. They need to build capacity for vulnerability that they currently lack. And the recognition that this work will be long and difficult and uncertain creates another layer of grief. Grief about all the time they've lost. Grief about the person they hurt before they were willing to do this work. Grief about the fact that the work will not bring you back. The fear of repeating the pattern also brings up existential questions about whether the avoidant is capable of change at all. The avoidant wonders if their attachment patterns are so fundamental to who they are that genuine transformation is impossible. They wonder if they're destined to hurt everyone who tries to love them. They wonder if the kindest thing they can do is stay out of relationships entirely until they've done enough healing to show up differently. These questions are painful because they involve confronting the possibility that the avoidant may not be capable of the kind of partnership they intellectually want, that their wounds may have damaged them in ways that cannot be fully repaired. But alongside the fear lives a different possibility, the possibility that hitting this bottom, that truly seeing the harm they've caused, that experiencing this depth of remorse and grief might actually create the conditions for genuine change. The avoidant recognizes that they were unable to do this work before because they were too defended to see the need for it. But now that they've seen, now that they can't unsee, now that they carry the full weight of what their patterns have cost, maybe they're finally desperate enough, finally humble enough, finally broken open enough to do the difficult work of transformation. The pain of recognizing what they did to you might be the very thing that motivates them to become capable of showing up differently for the next person who risks loving them. The realization that you're not coming back. Part of what makes the avoidance recognition so painful is that it often comes at a time when reconciliation is no longer possible. The avoidant sees what they did, understands what they destroyed, feels genuine remorse and desire to make amends, and then confronts the reality that you're gone. Not just physically gone from their life, but emotionally gone in the sense that you've moved past the version of yourself that loved them. You've healed. You've grown. You've built a life that doesn't include them. The door that used to be open is now closed, and the avoidant's belated recognition doesn't change that. This realization brings a particular quality of despair. The avoidant finally values what you offered at the precise moment when what you offered is no longer available. They finally see your worth at the moment when you've stopped making yourself available to them. They finally want to fight for the relationship at the moment when the relationship is irrevocably over. The timing of this recognition feels cruelly backward. If only they could have seen this clearly while you were still there, while the relationship was still alive, while there was still possibility of repair. The avoidant may go through a period of bargaining, of hoping that maybe if they reached out, if they explained how they've changed, if they demonstrated their new understanding, maybe you would give them another chance. But this hope confronts the reality that you've likely heard promises of change before, that you've likely given chances before, that the avoidance pattern included periods of seeming growth followed by return to old behaviors. The avoidant has to face that they've spent all their chances, that you have every reason not to trust that this time would be different, that asking you to take that risk again would be asking you to set yourself up for potential re-traumatization. The realization that you're not coming back also includes recognizing that you shouldn't come back. This is one of the most mature and painful recognitions the avoidant can reach, that even though they want you back, even though they're sorry, even though they believe they could do better now, the healthiest thing for you is to stay away from them. The avoidant sees that you deserve someone who doesn't have to destroy you before learning how to value you. You deserve someone who can show up consistently from the beginning, not someone who needs to hit bottom before becoming capable of basic emotional presence. The avoidant's love for you, if it's genuine, includes wanting what's best for you, and what's best for you is not to return to someone who has already proven they can devastate you. This recognition that the most loving thing the avoidant can do is let you go creates a grief that has no resolution. The avoidant must live with what they've done, carry the weight of the harm they caused, and resist the urge to seek comfort or forgiveness from the very person they harmed. They must do their healing work alone, knowing that the work will not bring you back, that the transformation they undergo will benefit future connections but cannot repair the past. They must sit with the finality of what they've lost, and with the knowledge that the loss was entirely of their own making. The transformation that may or may not come. The recognition of having destroyed your heart creates a crossroads for the avoidant. One path leads toward genuine transformation. The other leads toward continued defense, where the recognition gets reburied under the same protective mechanisms that caused the harm in the first place. The path toward transformation requires the avoidant to stay with the pain of recognition rather than defending against it. The avoidant must resist the urge to minimize what they did, to make excuses based on their attachment wounds, to rationalize their behavior as having been beyond their control. They must hold themselves fully accountable while also having compassion for the wounded parts of themselves that created the defensive patterns. This is difficult work because it requires the avoidant to tolerate shame without collapsing into it, to acknowledge harm without identifying as irredeemably bad. The transformation path includes getting into therapy specifically focused on attachment trauma and relational patterns. The avoidant must work with someone who can help them understand the roots of their defensive structure while also holding them accountable for the harm that structure has caused. The work includes learning to tolerate intimacy without fleeing, learning to stay present with discomfort, learning to communicate about their struggles rather than simply withdrawing. The work includes developing new nervous system responses so that closeness doesn't automatically trigger the need for distance, so that vulnerability doesn't automatically activate defenses. The transformation also requires the avoidant to make amends not just to you, but more broadly in their life. They must look at other relationships where they've enacted similar patterns and take responsibility. They must make different choices going forward, practice showing up with more consistency, practice staying when their instinct is to flee. They must let the recognition of what they did to you inform how they treat people moving forward, using the memory of the harm they caused as motivation to be better. But transformation is not guaranteed. The other path, the path of continued defense, is always available and often feels easier. On this path, the avoidant allows the initial recognition to fade. They let their defensive structure reassert itself. They tell themselves that yes, they hurt you, but you weren't perfect either. They tell themselves that the relationship just wasn't right, that the timing was off, that they've learned their lesson and will do better next time even without doing the deep work. They tell themselves that dwelling on past harm isn't productive, that they need to move forward rather than staying stuck in guilt. And gradually, the sharp edge of recognition dulls. The avoidant returns to their defended state, and the pattern continues. Which path the avoidant takes depends on many factors. It depends on whether they have support for the transformation work. It depends on whether their pain is acute enough to override their defenses. It depends on whether they're willing to invest the time and resources necessary for genuine healing. It depends on whether they can tolerate the vulnerability that transformation requires. There is no guarantee. The recognition of harm is necessary for change, but not sufficient for it. The avoidant can see what they did and still choose not to do the work necessary to ensure they don't do it again. For you, wherever you are in your own healing, the avoidance transformation or lack thereof is ultimately not your concern. Whether they use the recognition of what they did to you as a catalyst for genuine change or whether they bury it under continued defense doesn't change your path forward. Your work is your own healing, your own recovery of the trust and openness they damaged, your own journey toward connections that don't destroy you. The avoidance recognition validates that what you experienced was real and was harmful, but you don't need their recognition to know that. You lived it, you felt it, and you've been doing the work of healing from it regardless of whether they ever see what they did. The avoidance recognition, if and when it comes, is their burden to carry. They must live with the knowledge of what they destroyed. They must sit with the grief of what they lost. They must face the shame of who they were to you. And they must do this knowing that there is no going back, no undoing the harm, no reclaiming what was lost. This is the weight of recognizing you destroyed someone's heart. And it is a weight the avoidant will carry for the rest of their life, long after you've moved on, long after you've built something new, long after you've proven to yourself that what the avoidant did to you doesn't define your capacity to love and be loved.